Alan Good, patriarch of the Myrtleville household, was born in Cork, Ireland on November 14th, 1799. When he was about 14 years old, he left school and began an apprenticeship with Morgan and Reeves, a local merchant firm. Towards the end of his 7-year apprenticeship, he went to the West Indies on behalf of the company and had the misfortune of contracting yellow fever while in Jamaica. He survived the illness, though he did blame it for his early baldness. Also in his travels, he visited Newfoundland, though was unimpressed, and by 1836 he was employed by the Agricultural Bank of Ireland in Cork. In the spring of 1830, Alan married Eliza Carroll. While no early portraits of the two survive at Myrtleville, Eliza has been described as, quote, strong-minded woman with fair skin, blue eyes, and red gold hair done in a loose knot on the top of her head, unquote. And Alan was spoken of as a, quote, jovial gentleman who occasionally lost his temper in quite a spectacular fashion. On November 22nd, 1836, Alan Good and his family, which included his wife Eliza, their daughter Anne, and sons John and Charles, left Cork for Canada. Their crossing took over 5 weeks on the ship Hibernia, and throughout the trip, Eliza was desperately seasick. Luckily, Alan was not, and he watched over the children, who had much fun sliding back and forth on the deck as the ship tossed about. The family first arrived in New York, where they stayed for 2 weeks as Alan made various banking arrangements in the Wall Street district. They first moved to Montreal, where Alan had been appointed bank manager for the Bank of Montreal. The trek from Albany to Montreal took the family 12 days and was particularly hard on Eliza, who was 8 months pregnant at the time. Not long after arriving in Montreal, the family welcomed their 4th child and 2nd daughter, Charlotte Good. On July 31st, 1837, Alan had been let go from the bank, and the family decided to relocate to Brantford, where he had purchased 108 acres of land a few months prior to his dismissal. Eliza loved the country life, and she urged Alan to get away from the turmoil of the business world and become independent. Upon arriving in Brant County, the Good family stayed at a rental house for some months at the corner of Cobourn and Dumfries Street. Alan began drawing up the contracts for their new family home, which detailed a 2-story, 9-bedroom house with 7 fireplaces and no cellar, at the cost of £467, 5 shillings and 9 pence, which is about equal to $80,000. Now, Myrtleville House in Canada was designed after a home in Ireland with the same name. The original house was a country home located on the Bay of the Atlantic that got its name from the green myrtle shrubs which grew all around it. The original home had no basement, as Eliza said she hated cellars. Now, cellars in Ireland were quite different than those in early Canada, and having one in the home may have helped keep the family warm in the winters. Family lore says that the first generation of children at Myrtleville would switch sides of the dinner table after the main course in order to have equal share of the proximity to the fireplace. By the end of 1841, the Goods had welcomed 2 more daughters into the fold, Eliza, Elizabeth in full, in 1839, and Frances Anne in December of 1841. Since there was no school conveniently close to Myrtleville at this point, the older of the 6 children were taught at home by their parents. On August 28th, 1843, Thomas Good, the 7th child and 3rd son, was born. Anne, the oldest of the bunch, was 12 at that point and, quote, an expert nursemaid, unquote. Whenever there was a new baby, she took almost complete charge of the next youngest of her siblings. As she got older, it seems she was quite the organized young lady. She noted on November 27, 1847, that her daily schedule consisted of the following: get up between 6 and 7 and get breakfast, and after breakfast make the beds with Mama. 8:30, attend Aunt Fanny's reading and then make candles. 9:45, hear the children spelling. 10 o'clock, read Roland's Ancient History. Between 11 and 12 was for music, and the remainder of the day consisted of needlework, writing, or any business about the house that needed tending to. And she specified that the afternoons on Tuesday and Friday were dedicated to drawing. By 1849, Allen Good was an established Brantford businessman, although continued to do well in farming. His eldest son, John, noted that, quote, the farm is getting on pretty well. Papa has 340 acres of land, and there is another farm between our two which I think Papa will have yet. We have 10 working horses and 7 colts, unquote. He also made note of early mechanized farm equipment being used on their property. By 1850, the final 4 of Allen and Eliza's children had been born. Thomas in 1843, Isabella in 1845, Mary in 1848, and Clara in 1850. Now, Clara, interestingly enough, is the only one of the 10 children not to have been named after someone in the family. And with 6 older sisters, it seems that her family had run out of options. The family's ex-tutor, Mr. Wright, noted on July 3rd, 1854, quote, how I would like to be at Myrtleville today. I just fancy I should find Mrs. Good and Annie doing up the housework, just as they know how to do it, in the very best style. Mr. Good and Tommy in town, the one in the insurance office and the other at school. Aunt Fanny diligently molding the minds of the little ones upstairs, just as I used to do. John and Charles out in the fields taking care of those noble 600 acres. Charlotte and Eliza, the former discoursing sweet music at the piano. I must say I have not heard as sweet since I left Canada. And the latter with her sunbonnet on, weeding a flower bed or trimming a plant, so as to make the garden and the yard look beautiful. And last, not least, some friend who was always sure to find a hearty welcome at Myrtleville, unquote. The poor harvest that Allen faced in 1857 came at a particularly inopportune time for the family. The end of the Crimean War, the year before, had reduced the prices for farm products, and there was another depression which mirrored the one in 1837. Additionally, Allen had lent his son Charles $2,000 for a business venture in 1858 that did not pan out, all the while still having to fund an extension to the north side of the house. In the spring of 1861, Allen was busy with seating and local politics, so the 2 Elizas were in charge of the home. Anne was visiting a friend in Arthabaska, Quebec for 3 months, and John was courting a woman from Elora. The main focus of conversation in the home, at that time, was John's courtship, as well as the brewing tensions in the United States. Charles wrote to Anne that, quote, the principal topic of conversation here is the lamentable state of affairs existing in the U.S. It is really astonishing that the hostile attitudes of one portion towards the other has not resulted in the commencement of hostilities ere this, but the time is probably not far distant when there will be some severe fighting. The northern people seem very sanguine of being able to coerce the South into submission and perpetuating the Union as it lately existed. My opinion is that the seceded states will never again be united as formerly." Unquote. When Anne returned from her trip in 1861, she arrived home to find that John's romance had collapsed and that her younger sister Eliza was, quote, very unhappy, unquote, and wished to end her engagement to Andrew Jones. Eliza had been described as intelligent, though not necessarily the most sensible, and likely the most hopeless romantic of her brood of siblings. She first declared that she wouldn't marry Jones, but when she saw how angry that made her family, she relented to the engagement. 2 days before the wedding, Anne and Eliza made their way to Brantford to purchase a wedding dress. When the two of them were shopping, they encountered a man named DeRoche, who said he loved Eliza, and then the engagement between her and Jones was called off. Anne notes that, quote, Jones returned home to Maitland, and Eliza seemed like one reprieved from execution. I never saw a person in such state of mind and horror. The affair was a complete talk of the town for some weeks, which, of course, was very disagreeable. Allen wrote to Andrew Jones 3 times after his departure from Myrtleville, the third of which being a response consenting to Jones's marriage proposal to Frances Anne, Eliza's immediate younger sister. The two wed on September 26, 1861, and the couple left Myrtleville with Frances's sister Charlotte and her husband around midnight. Fanny and Andrew moved into Homewood, a property owned by the Jones family on the shores of the St. Lawrence River. As for Eliza and Mr. DeRoche, Anne notes in her journal that, quote, Mr. DeRoche visited the house for about a month, but before Fanny's marriage, he deserted Eliza. On April 8, 1862, the eldest Goodchild, John, set out to try his luck with gold mining in British Columbia. As a teen, he had always dreamed of traveling to the Australian goldfields, but was convinced otherwise. Before joining the migration, he sold his stock for a total of $650, which would be a start for investments in the West. While closer than Australia, John's journey was still a difficult one, first having to travel to New York, then Panama, then San Francisco, before eventually arriving in Victoria. He noted while in New York, quote, the stir of this place would make anyone forget they were tired. I never saw anything like it in my life. The number of people that are on the go from daylight till dark and everyone in a hurry, unquote. The trip to San Francisco took about 3 weeks, and once in Victoria, he started to sound doubtful of his adventure. He wrote home, quote, If I was at home and knew as much as I do now about this country, no one would hear me say I was going to Victoria, I can assure you, unquote. That same summer, 16-year-old Isabella, the 8th of the 10 good children, headed off to spend several months with her older sister Fanny, as the elder sister was expecting a child. Bella wrote to Anne that, quote, Fanny is sitting near me, mending Andrew's stockings, and is making me laugh so hard that I can barely write a bit. Andrew keeps me in a fit the whole time he's in the house. You never saw such a house as this good for eating, unquote. When Fanny's due date drew closer, Eliza Sr. left Myrtleville for Homewood in order to assist with the birth. Allen wrote on July 27th, We were in expectation of hearing from you. Your last letter was dated on the day of your arrival. You know as well as I can tell you that we feel anxious about you, Fanny, and all the family. For goodness sake, do write at all events twice in the week. Never mind about postage. We'll pay that on arrival of your letters, unquote. Allen need not worry, however, as on July 29, 1862, his first grandson, Harold Jones, was born. Eliza returned home to Myrtleville the week of August 10th, and Fanny, Bella, and baby Harold not long after, in early September. Fanny stayed until after her brother Charles's wedding to Catherine Hardy on September 23rd. Now, you may be curious, what happened with John's gold mining adventure? On September 22nd, the day before Charles's wedding, the Goods received a letter from Victoria, BC. It was from John and detailed how his trip to the Caribou Goldfield had been a total disaster. Over 11,000 men had gone there during that season, and all were unsuccessful in their quest for gold. Hundreds were leaving every week to make their way back to San Francisco. John had lost most of the $650 that he had brought with him, so in this letter he mustered the courage to ask Allen for a loan. Unfortunately, he received no help from his father, who was heavily in debt at that time, so John continued to work odd jobs before making his way back home. In 1863, Allen, who was in large amounts of debts dating back to the 1850s, lost his position at the insurance office, where he worked in Brantford for the previous 16 years. This lack of income, paired with no longer receiving money from his business ventures in Ireland, meant that the debts he owed became too much, and on November 9th, 1863, there was a forced sale of property at Myrtleville. It was Anne that rescued the family. She had money of her own, coming into some following the passing of her Aunt Frances and earning some from candle making. She purchased enough stock to keep a small farm going on the property, as well as 3 horses, Larry, Jack, and Kate. On New Year's Eve, 1863, Anne wrote the following in her journal. Quote, "This, like all the years of my life, has been one mixed with troubles and pleasures. I have very many mercies for which to be thankful, almost uninterrupted health of body and peace of mind. We are now reduced almost to poverty and do not know whether we will be allowed to remain in our old home. If it would at all comport with the will of our Heavenly Father, I should wish it very much, at least as long as Mama and Papa live." Unquote. 1864 was another difficult year for the family. Allen is described as being, quote, "insolvent," due to the reduction of his status in the community. The once 600-acre farm at Myrtleville had been reduced down to about 70, all of which was owned by his wife and his daughter. All of his children were haunted by the idea of losing Myrtleville, and they all helped out in whatever way they could, often sending increments of money home to assist in the daily operations. The following year, in 1865, there was yet another scandal involving the Good's daughter, Eliza. She had decided that she was going to marry a gentleman named George Laird, an employee at her brother-in-law, George Mallock's office in Brantford. Now, Allen and Eliza Sr. knew of Laird well enough to know that despite his charm and good looks, they wanted nothing to do with him as a son-in-law. While there are no records of their specific objections to the marriage that survive, it seems like the younger Eliza didn't listen to them anyway, as the two wed on December 4th, 1865. Eliza and George Laird later moved to Oil Creek, Pennsylvania, where George pursued a living in the oil industry. In the fall of 1867, John Good became quite ill, so much so that Anne took over the management of the farm. She wrote to her brother Thomas on October 16th, quote, "I am so sorry to tell you that John proves to be much more seriously ill than we were led to suppose. On Monday he commenced coughing severely, and ever since it has continued. At each fit of coughing he spits up large quantities of the most dreadful phlegm, or rather yellow matter. In any case, he will probably be unable to do any work during the winter if he recovers, which I think is very doubtful." Unquote. Shortly after that letter, Arthur Hardy, Charles's brother-in-law, visited Myrtleville to discuss John's will. Anne was deemed the executrix of John's estate, which was dictated to, quote, "sell his possessions, real and personal, pay $500 to his widow, and hold the rest in trust for his son, James Allen Good, until he reached 21. Anne wrote to Tom again around mid-November. Quote, "I have told Charles how John is. I fear there is a poor chance for him. And what a bill for the doctors there will be. He is able to dress and sit in an armchair in the parlor. He has not been a part of the house for nearly 2 months." Unquote. John made progress in his healing and made a trip to Elora with his wife and son in early 1868. Even more so, as the spring arrived, he was well enough to resume working on the farm and continued to do so throughout that summer. His wife Mary was pregnant again, and all seemed well. The two welcomed their second son near the end of October 1868, but John unexpectedly collapsed and died 9 days after the birth. On November 10th, the child was christened, and the day after, John Good was buried. Family lore said that he had died from consumption, and at the time of his passing, he was only 35. Following John's death, Tom, the youngest of the Good brothers, took over the role of helping Anne run the farm. Charles was unable to assist much, as he was working lengthy days in the city as a bookkeeper. With the 4 youngest siblings, Tom, Bella, Mary, and Clara, as well as John's widow, Mary, living at Myrtleville in the early 1870s, the farm was quite the hub of social activity. Many attendants of Grace Church would recall how Mrs. Good, Eliza, would enjoy playing the piano for her guests to dance to. However, they all understood that when she would play God Save the Queen, that was their cue to leave. Many of the neighbors would be in attendance at these parties, like the Moyles, Bellaccis, Ushers, and Wees. The Goods also hosted Alexander Graham Bell once or twice. He was the cousin of the Bellacci family, and Eliza, quote, especially admired his beautiful singing and piano playing, unquote. Around the same time, the aging Alan and Eliza were enjoying their time with their growing brood of grandchildren. The oldest, 15-year-old Lily Malik, was making plans to travel to Europe with her parents, Charlotte and George. Those plans were interrupted when Charlotte welcomed their second child, Sally, in September of 1873. 3 more of the Good siblings were married by the mid-1870s, starting with Mary. The pretty and popular daughter of Alan and Eliza was wed to Sam Bellacci in 1873, and the two moved to Paisley, Ontario, the following year, not far from where Mary's sister Charlotte and her family were living. The next was Bella, who had become acquainted with Will Doyle, a young widower and veteran of the United States Union Army. The pair married on December 14, 1874. This left the family living at Myrtleville, feeling quite small compared to earlier years, as there were just Alan, Eliza, Anne, Tom, Clara, and John's widow Mary, as well as her 2 boys living on the farm. Tom was 31 when his sister Bella was married, and considered, quote, quite an old bachelor, unquote. He was described as being a good-looking young man, tall and slender, with sandy red hair and blue eyes. He had plenty of friends and seems to have been adored by his nieces and nephews. After his sister Mary wed Sam Bellacci, Tom saw quite a bit of Sam's sister, Mary. She was, quote, a small and gentle girl who shared Tom's love of horses, and in spite of her timidity about many things, was an intrepid rider, unquote. It was speculated that Tom may have found this meekness a refreshing contrast to the strong-mindedness of many of his female relatives. And the two were married in 1875 and welcomed their first child, William Charles Good, in February of 1876. Alan Good's long struggle with health issues came to an end on December 21st, 1876, when he was 77. Charlotte wrote to her widowed mother, quote, I know how very sad and lonely you will feel now that you have Papa no more to wait on. But when you consider what he has suffered for so many years, you would hardly regret to see him at peace. I hope Annie and Clara are well, and I am glad to hear how kind Tom is to you all." Unquote. After Alan's death, Eliza continued to assist in the upbringing of her grandchildren where she could. 2 of her daughters, Eliza and Fanny, both welcomed their 4th children in 1877. Tom and Mary also welcomed a daughter that year, named Mary Elizabeth Ann. She later became known as Mamie due to the abundance of Marys in the Good family. And Tom's wife, Mary, wrote to her brother, William Bellacci, about Eliza in 1880. Quote, "Mrs. Good is now over 70 and suffers from pain nearly all the time. She is most industrious and knits, sews, and sometimes makes beautiful netted neckties. She is a very practical turn of mind, orderly and dignified in all that she does, and is a good woman waiting for her Lord's call to go from this world of pain and suffering. She is extremely fond of her children, which affection is warmly returned by all. I have never saw a mother more esteemed." Unquote. Eliza taught William Charles, then 5 years old, how to read, and he caught on very quickly. He was a merry child and in danger of being somewhat spoiled by his aunties. Now, Eliza knew full well that she was living on borrowed time, and drew up a will that detailed how she would like her small estate to be divided upon her passing. 50 years after its construction, Myrtleville was still home to the Goods, though by 1887, the front of the house resembled more of a hospital than a home. Eliza Good, 80 years old at that time, needed much more assistance moving about the home than in previous years. In the bedroom next to hers, her grandson Johnny had regular coughing fits caused by tuberculosis. And in the downstairs bedroom, once the more excitable and vivacious of her siblings, Eliza Laird was, quote, "miserable, shaky, and almost unable to walk," unquote. It is said that her husband George had all but abandoned her. And throughout all of this, Anne had taken up the role as the calm and cheerful head nurse for her family members. In March of 1888, Eliza's already failing health had declined considerably. She passed away on April 6th of that year, just 2 days after she turned 81. She had lived in Brantford for 50 years and had seen the area grow from a village of less than 1,000 people to a city of over 13,000. She was survived by 8 of her 10 children, as well as 27 grandchildren. Upon her death, the primary residents at the farm were Tom Good, his wife Mary, their 5 children, as well as Eliza Laird and Clara Good. Without the help from his brothers, Tom relied heavily on hired hands to help operate the farm. And join us on September 5th for episode 5 of the podcast, which will continue the story of the Good family at Myrtleville from 1890 to 1960. The majority of this information for this episode was sourced from Myrtleville, a Canadian farm and family, 1837 to 1967, by Beth Good Latzer. Copies can be found for purchase through our website at the Brant Historical Society, or can be borrowed from the Brantford Public Library.